Project 2025.
Project 2025.
Project 2025.
Project 2025.
Pennsylvania.
Project 2025. Power, Profit, and the Shadow Government. A deep investigation into the forces behind a radical plan to reshape American democracy. In the corridors of Washington, power does not change hands by accident. Presidential transitions are typically choreographed, orderly affairs, governed by decades of precedent. But a document quietly making the rounds in conservative policy circles since 2023 suggests something different. Project 2025, Presidential Transition Project, is not just a transition plan, it is a detailed roadmap for an ideological takeover of the U.S. government. Drafted by a coalition of right-wing think tanks and operatives, this sprawling 920-page document lays out a vision for remaking the federal government in a way that consolidates executive power, purges nonpartisan civil servants, and shifts billions in economic benefits toward corporate and political allies. And unlike past Republican transition efforts, which have typically been led by traditional conservatives focused on limited government, Project 2025 is driven by a far more radical vision, one that overlaps with authoritarian movements and reactionary ideologies, including the neo-reactionary NRX movement. To understand what Project 2025 is and why it matters, it's necessary to examine its authors, its connections to Trump's orbit, its ideological roots, and most importantly, whose think tank that has aggressively promoted Trumpism as a governing philosophy and justified legal theories supporting authoritarian rule. Hillsdale College, a small Christian school that has become a major player in conservative politics, shaping policy on education, religious liberty, and executive power. The Center for Renewing America, led by Trump's former Office of Management and Budget Director, Russell Vought, which has pushed for the destruction of federal agencies and mass firings of career civil servants. The American Cornerstone Institute, founded by former HUD Secretary Ben Carson, which promotes hardline social conservatism and Christian nationalism. While the Heritage Foundation's name gives Project 2025 mainstream legitimacy, its real intellectual and ideological DNA comes from more extreme sources, people who believe democracy itself is an impediment to governance. A war on the civil service. One of Project 2025's most radical proposals is a dramatic expansion of Schedule F, a classification of federal employees that would allow a sitting president to fire thousands of career civil servants and replace them with political loyalists. This is not a theoretical idea. Toward the end of Trump's first term, his administration issued an executive order creating Schedule F, targeting employees and policy-making rules for dismissal. The move would have stripped tens of thousands of career government employees of their civil service protections, making them vulnerable to removal based on political loyalty rather than job performance. The Biden administration rescinded Schedule F upon taking office, but Project 2025 makes it clear that a second Trump administration would bring it back, and on a much larger scale. If implemented, this would allow a Trump-aligned administration to fire up to 50,000 government employees, eliminating the nonpartisan core of federal agencies. Scientists at the EPA, economic analysts at the Federal Reserve, cybersecurity experts at CISA, all could be replaced with political appointees. Former Trump administration officials have been candid about the goal. John McEntee, who led Trump's presidential personnel office, openly stated that in a second Trump term, the priority would be to completely obliterate the deep state. The consequences of this cannot be overstated. Agencies that currently operate with some level of independence, such as the Department of Justice, the IRS, and intelligence agencies, would become overtly politicized. Federal law enforcement could be weaponized against political opponents. Economic policy could be dictated not by career experts, but by partisan operatives. And there are those who stand to benefit handsomely. Follow the money. Who profits from Project 2025? While Project 2025 is framed as an ideological project, it is also an economic one. A closer look at its policies reveals massive financial incentives for certain industries and wealthy benefactors. Big oil and environmental rollbacks. One of Project 2025's most explicit goals is the dismantling of environmental protections, including reversing Biden-era climate policies and eliminating regulatory oversight of the energy sector. This would be a financial windfall for fossil fuel companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Koch Industries, which have long opposed environmental regulations that cut into their profit margins. By rolling back emissions standards, lifting restrictions on drilling, and gutting the Environmental Protection Agency, Project 2025 could deliver up to $110 billion in regulatory rollbacks and tax breaks to the oil and gas industry. Private prisons and mass deportations. The plan's aggressive approach to immigration enforcement is another major economic driver. By increasing funding for detention centers, reintroducing family separation policies, and expanding deportation programs, Project 2025 would create a boom for private prison contractors like GEO Group and CoreCivic. These companies, which operate many of the nation's immigration detention facilities, depend on government contracts for their profits. Under Trump, ICE contracts with private prisons surged. If Project 2025 is enacted, these contracts could increase by at least $1.9 billion annually. Defense contractors and the militarization of America. The plan also calls for expanded domestic surveillance, increased law enforcement funding, and military-led border security operations, a boon for the defense industry. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Palantir stand to gain billions in new government contracts. The surveillance state would expand, and tech firms specializing in AI-driven security solutions, including those backed by Peter Thiel, would see massive growth. The projected windfall? $25 billion in new defense and surveillance spending. Christian nationalists and the religious right. Beyond economic beneficiaries, Project 2025 caters heavily to conservative Christian organizations and donors. It calls for federal funding for religious schools, the elimination of diversity programs, and the reintroduction of faith-based initiatives across the government. Billionaire donors such as Timothy Mellon, the DeVos family, and the Wilkes brothers have invested heavily in policies that align with Project 2025. By shifting federal dollars toward private religious institutions and stripping funding from public services, their influence over national education and policy would grow significantly. The New York's connection. The ideological underpinnings of autocracy. Beneath the economic incentives lies an even more extreme intellectual foundation. Project 2025 reflects the growing influence of the neo-reactionary NRX movement, a radical ideology that seeks to replace democracy with authoritarian rule. Curtis Yarvin, one of NRX's most influential thinkers, has argued for replacing democratic governance with a CEO-style executive who wields absolute power. His ideas, once fringe, have gained traction among influential conservatives, including venture capitalists like Peter Thiel. While Yarvin's name does not appear in Project 2025, his ideas do. The proposal to expand presidential power, eliminate independent agencies, and centralize control in the executive branch closely mirrors his vision of an American monarchy. Figures like Michael Anton, a former Trump national security official and Claremont Institute fellow, have promoted similar ideas, advocating for a more authoritarian approach to governance. The future, a blueprint for permanent rule. If implemented, Project 2025 would not simply reshape the government, it would fundamentally alter the nature of American democracy. By eroding checks and balances, consolidating power within the executive branch, and rewarding loyalist corporations, it lays the groundwork for a form of government where elections become a formality rather than a meaningful transfer of power. For now, Project 2025 is a document, but the people behind it are preparing for action. With billions in funding and an ideological framework that prioritizes power over process, the machinery is already in motion. The question is, who's paying attention?